Are you satisfied with your understanding of sustainability? If not, like me, imagine a journey together, a pluralistic one, with innovators, startup, academia, NGO, all together looking for solution to the greatest challenge of our time. I'm Samuele Tini, and this is the Sustainability Journey.
Welcome to another episode, and today I'm pleased to meet an author, somebody who has an extensive experience of East Africa and Kenya in particular, who has written a book that touched my heart because has written about two of the themes that I really like, and they are part of this journey, our sustainability journey, that is conservation and regeneration of ecosystem. Very pleased to have today Peter Martell. Thank you so much, Peter, to being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here.
Peter, you have written this wonderful book, Flowers for Elephants. And it's a book that touched me and really showed a story on how we can have communities and conservation together to really give a regeneration of an environment, of an ecosystem. Before going there, I want to ask, who is Peter? What is your sustainability journey?
Well, thank you for having me on here. I'm a journalist, is what I do in my day job. I used to work for the BBC, and I currently work for the French news agency AFP. And I'm British, but I spent nearly getting on for 2 decades in East Africa, in the Horn of Africa. I grew up, however, on a farm in northern England. So, I'm rooted very much in a sort of rural community. But over the years, working as a foreign correspondent, I was based in Eritrea, in Yemen, in Sudan, and then in South Sudan in the run up to independence. And then moved to Kenya and came to tell the story of the Northern Rangeland Trust in northern Kenya because of things that I'd seen along the way. Although as a journalist, you sort of focus on the day-to-day, by and large, political happenings, what the president said, what happened in the accident, who died in which battle. But there was a bigger theme that I felt and that I saw, which was a sort of sense of growing impacts of climate change, of conflict exacerbated by climate change, of people struggling to survive in their environments. So they'd done so for millennia, and now the situation was changing through threats to resources. And I'd seen that in South Sudan, for example, with giant cattle raids involving hundreds of people killed. And I'd seen it in Somalia, where the creation of charcoal was devastating forests and creating climate change there, and drought and famine. It's something that I felt was a much bigger picture, and all I was doing as a journalist was telling the day-to-day story, what happened today, and not that bigger sense of the threats that face us all, that especially these regions that are dry lands, that are really on the edge, that are being the hardest hit as the planet changes. So that's a little bit of where I'm coming from.
That is very interesting. I'm really happy. And I would say also it's a positive story, which I think also we are used in the press to get the famine, the disaster, the problem. But I think also it's a book that also open our heart on how to see that it's not just problems, but also there are solutions. And I want to dig a bit deeper before going now to the book and the work, the wonderful book of NRT that we have discussed. You see, you have extensively worked in the region. How have you seen the region and the conservation in this fragile ecosystem?
The answer to that question could be told in 2 ways. One, that threats facing wildlife populations, biodiversity, the environment are enormous. And I think, and rightly so, some people will say, that the future is bleak. But at the same time, I think the other way one can answer that question is to look at the things that the work and the efforts that people are making to really trying to mitigate those impacts and to make change. And there are some really positive efforts going on and real change being made. So on one hand, the sustainability, environmental impacts in northern Kenya and in the wider region are enormous, but things can be done and change can be made.
And this is exactly what your book is telling about. It's telling about the story of the Northern Rangeland Trust. You start with these 2 guys, Ian and Kinyanjui. a couple that it's also an old couple that started this journey. Can you tell more about that?
Northern Rangeland Trust, for those who don't know, it's a sort of patchwork, a network of community conservancies, mainly across northern Kenya, but also on the coast of Kenya, that now covers an area about roughly adding up to about a tenth of the size of the entire country, which isn't far off the size of all the national parks and reserves put together. So it's a huge area. And it's an incredibly complex organization involving different languages, different ethnic groups, different communities, different geographic areas. But the story that I wanted to tell was not so much about all the bureaucratic organization, but how it began and how that inspired me to tell this story. And that, as you said, started with these essentially two friends, Ian Craig, who grew up on he's of a British extraction, grew up on what was then a cattle ranch called Lewa, just south of Isiolo and north of Nanyuki. And he was a guy that loved just exploring the wildlife as a young kid. And his dad was so scared because as a teenager, at age 13, 14, he would just disappear out the window to go and roam around the bush, that he would be munched up by a lion. So his dad found a young cattle herder called Kinyanjui, who comes from Ilingwezi, of a Maasai group, and asked him, just a few years older than Ian, said, could you look after this guy to make sure that when he goes off roaming, that there's someone to look after him? And so what began as essentially a teenage friendship has been a friendship that stayed through their lives. And I think each of them allowed the other to somehow step into their lives, gave them a window or a doorway into the perspective through a mutual friendship, but allowed each other to see the perspective of the other. And that would help Ian, when he decided to turn with the rest of his family to turn Lewa, which was then a struggling cattle ranch, as I said, every time drought hit, the cattle ranch would struggle and they would verge on the edge of bankruptcy, to start looking at it in a different way. And they ended up turning it into a rhino sanctuary at a time when rhinos were in northern Kenya, especially, being hunted down to the very, very last animal. And with Kinyanjui, he got permission from what would become the Kenya Wildlife Service, the government, and would go out and round up and catch these individual animals that on their own might survive, if they were lucky, a few more years hiding from the poachers, but would never contribute to a sustainable population because they were isolated and separate in ones or maybe even just twos, and would go and capture them and bring them back to Lewa and provide what in the end has become the success story of Lewa. And now, of course, the rhinos on Lewa, generations later, are being sent back out to areas they were exterminated from. So, a real success story there. And that was where the roots of what this community conservation movement would become. That's where the roots lie in this, essentially, a friendship between two teenage boys and obviously two men now.
I really loved the story. You see, from the dramatic account of the destruction in the 80s and 90s, the killing and the slaughter that was coming, these two men standing against all the odds, trying to go and get the last rhino. And then from there, the first community, the Namuyak, and all the work that has been done. I just want to ask you, because you have been there more than a year, walking the travel and then seeing and being with these exceptional people. Can you give us some stories, something that has impacted you?
Northern Kenya is simply one of the most spectacular places I've ever seen, and so geographically diverse, from these beautiful high mountains to arid desert bush areas, and then these mountains that rear up like Marsabit and up to Namunyak and Wagis, what also is called the Matthews Range. These what they call sky mountains, and these huge peaks rise out and they catch the mist and the cloud. And so although down on the lower levels, you're walking through cracked red earth, so dry, your foot's going to go through holes where the ground crack. Then you scramble up for hours and hours and you get to the top and you're suddenly in not far off a rainforest. It's so misty and cool, and it's where all the elephants go in the dry season to hang out, and a completely different ecosystem with unique plants that aren't really found anywhere else. Spending time with the people who live in this land was an extraordinary experience. And I think maybe now's a good time to tell the story of why it's called I titled the book Flowers for Elephants, because the book is a story of community conservation movement. But Flowers for Elephants comes from when I was out walking in the Matthews Range with a Samburu guide, and he and the other rangers I was with would stop every time they found an elephant skull. And these huge skulls, the sort of size of a waist high white bones, and the rest of the bones would have been taken away by hyenas or lost over the years, but the skulls remained. And they would approach it with reverence. And some of them would break off green branches or the branches with these beautiful blossoms on, and they would stick it in the eye socket or where the elephant's trunk had been, the hole left by this, as a sort of way of offering it as a memorial, of marking it, just as they would do with their family when their family would be buried under piles of stones, and they would stick in fresh green branches as a way of like laying flowers on a grave, I suppose, in Europe. It was such a touching moment. It showed a real connection that I think, speaking as a European, that we've lost so much in Europe and in the West, of this connection that still remains between wild animals and the people who live alongside them. People view themselves as being part of nature in a way that I think the West has lost to its detriment. That people are living with nature and understanding its importance. That we're all part of the tangled string, and I think we've seen that with COVID. Is suddenly we realize that you start damaging an ecosystem. In the end, we're not separate from that. We are all part of it. And I suppose that was why I chose this as the title, because it was such a beautiful image, so emotional and so moving, to understand how we're all connected to each other, both as humans, but as species, from top to bottom.
I loved the story, you tell about the Samburu tales about the origin of elephants, and this moment, you describe wonderfully this moment in the book. And what you just said, I think you touched the core of what the NRT mission and vision is, to work together with community, empowering community, reconcile, in the imaginary. We have the community, we see some narratives saying, the community, they cannot live alone, wildlife, they are agent of destruction. Instead, they have proven in this almost 30 years of work, this connection and work, reconnecting community, wildlife, and conservation in an holistic way, and as well engaging them and in what they mattered most. In fact, one part of the book is about getting on board the community and working, and the lesson learned on that. Can you explain a bit more? This is the core one.
Absolutely. I mean, what NRT is doing, or what community conservancy doing, it is incredibly simple. It's creating a community council to manage the land upon which people live there, earn their living from, and is theirs as a community land. So it's just creating some sort of community structure to allow people to put in decisions about their land. And often this is something that people have done for millennia. This is part of their governance structure existing, but in somehow formalizing it, it gives the communities a structure to better protect their land, to face, and I think this is the key thing, that the challenges of the modern age as climate change becomes more dramatic, and also against security threats. So it's about bringing people together to manage their own resources. And so, as I said, on one hand, incredibly simple, but on the other hand, that involves enormous complexities. But in areas where there is relatively little central governance from either counties or governance in Nairobi, these community conservancies, by putting in place these structures, can provide in a much better way, right on the ground, how to make decisions for the community's best interests. And as I was discussing before about the Flowers for Elephants, this is about a holistic approach for all the environment. So that involves protecting the land, making sure that trees are not being cut down or wastefully cut down, and that rangelands are being managed, the grass areas for grazing for cattle, that the wildlife upon which everything depends as well, it's all part of one system, are all living in some sort of coexistence. So that's what the conservancies are trying to do. And given the history of colonial exploitation, the sense of outsiders coming in and saying we want to manage your land is obviously going to be a controversial and difficult thing, which is why it's so important that these are community rooted. And that's why I was just an independent observer. I'm nothing to do with NRT. I wasn't paid by them. I was going in as a journalist, as a cynical journalist, to see if this thing was actually really working as people were saying. And I was really happily surprised to see, that there was positive change being made through these communities coming together. And in areas where 10, 20 years before, the cattle raids and were of a level where insecurity was so bad. I mean, people would say one old man said that he didn't sleep with his shoes on because he was so frightened that at any time there could be a cattle raid and he would have to get up and run. That was 20 years ago. And by putting in place these structures, it's created security, it's helped create better governance, that's brought in donor money, that's helped create different employment opportunities and economic benefits. And so, as a holistic approach, it's really started to change the dynamics of these communities for the better.
I want to go a bit deeper on that, because one of the story that you tell in the book is something that it's a sign of the work that this community movement and the work and entrusting the community to be their leader has done. And especially also healing the long story of fighting and cattle rising and the divide between community. And I'm talking about the history of Josephine. Can you tell me a bit more about her and this wonderful leadership example?
Yeah, she's an extraordinary lady, Josephine Nakuru, from a conservancy called Nakupra Gotu, which is a little bit northeast of Isiolo. It's a very dry, arid area, but it's full of oryx. It's a really beautiful, austere land. And back in the 90s, back in the early 2000s, the area was absolutely hammered by poachers coming in to wipe out. They'd already killed all the rhinos that happened to be there, and then they were targeting elephants. And Josephine, in a very sort of male-dominated society, is an extraordinary lady who was able to sort of stand up and make a change. And she went around trying to persuade, because she knew who the local guides were, who were guiding in poachers and who were killing the elephants, and persuade them face to face to say, look, what we're doing is damaging our community and we should be protecting the wildlife. And she had this phrase. She said, when the Turkana people who she comes from and would move to an area, they would see the sign that there was wildlife around, whether that was antelopes or elephants or giraffe, as being a good sign that the land was blessed, that this was a place that was going to be safe also for their cattle, because it meant there was water and there was grazing. And she was seeing this wholesale slaughter of elephants, and then moving on to other animals as well, as something that was damaging the community's most precious resource, which was their land and environment itself. And so she went up to these poachers and tried to persuade them. And in the end, she was ended up being held up by gunpoint by the poachers and threatened to be killed. But she still continued, and they let her go in the end. And slowly by slowly, she won people over, people who clearly were aware that what they were doing was damaging to the environment, but they didn't know almost how to break out of that cycle of violence, how to get out of the problem that they got themselves involved in. And she ended up becoming one of the first chairmen of her conservancy. And she now works as a peace ambassador for NRT, for all the different communities. She will go between them to bring rival groups together and try to get people to sit down, to talk over their problems, to ask what's the issue, rather than fighting it out with guns. So why don't we sit down, we kill a few goats and sit under a tree and talk about it and see what can be resolved. So yeah, her story is very emotional, very moving, and she's a really great individual to have met. And I suppose her story is also important because it really reflects that story of what NRT is doing is not about outsiders coming in to tell Samburu or the Pokot or the Turkana or the Somali what to do. This is very much individuals from those communities themselves who are taking a stand to try to lead their own community to a better way. And I was really privileged as an outsider, as a journalist, to come and to be able to watch that and just to report on it for a little bit, to hear their stories.
And this is exactly why I really loved the book, because you tell the story of the CEO now, NRT, Tom, who is just a Maasai herding his cattle and sheep, but with an MBA and leading such a big organization. So you can see the roots and the work in the community, but also his work and the prize that has won all over. So It's something that healed the community and given tangible benefits. And this is also what you tell in the book, that some of the lessons learned during the journey of NRT, when in area where the community was not involved properly, that is where it was not coming on board. But where the community is there and the work is togetherness, then we see and then sprouted. And the results are amazing. I want just to point out, maybe you can tell the last story, which really also touched me. The first community-owned rhino sanctuary, something that really, it's amazing, and the first, like I think in the whole of Africa.
Yeah, I think so. Or certainly in East Africa. It's called Serra, again, north of Isiolo, near a little town called Serra-Lippi. And it's this wild, beautiful area of dry, arid thorn lands. And it's an area that, for the cattle herders, they would have gone into only once or twice a year, really, because there was limited amount of water. And it was through NRT and through the community conservancy themselves, they identified this area that they could be fenced off. And it's one of the few areas that is actually fenced off within our NRT, but it's fenced off because of the security that's needed to protect the rhinos there. But they fenced off the reserve and started to return rhinos, some of which came from Lewa, which was where the rhinos had been almost collected from, not these ones themselves, but their mothers or their grandparents, I guess, back in the 80s. And there was now enough rhinos on Lewa to be able to return them to some of the areas they've been wiped out by poachers in. And suddenly you had rhinos returning to an area where, some of the community in Serra said rhino were almost becoming stories of legends, of myths. That their grandparents would talk about going through the bush and hearing or seeing the footprints of a rhino. And suddenly now they were being returned and they're flourishing. It's a great country for rhino. And they've put in some really innovative projects, such as creating these things called sand dams. So building like concrete walls across a gully, across a narrow stream. When the storms come, it fills up with sand, and that holds the water for a much longer time than an open air reservoir, if you want. And for that, that's perfect. The rhinos can dig down and drink, get the water from the sand like that. And so, yeah, an incredible place to see. And when you go there, you can track them on foot, which is, again, a unique experience. And the money that they're raising through the visitors that go and track them and watch them goes back towards the community and is paying for the salaries for the staff and for other community projects that the Conservancy chooses.
Thank you for those wonderful stories. We have seen, and through the book, you demonstrate the impacts through also the social work, the restoration of rangeland, which has enabled also cattle to flourish, the work also for empowerment of women. And I urge also people to go and read the reports. Also, when peace comes, also donors comes, the work on wells, on water and sanitation, which really has brought on board the community and embraced the movement. Of course, even in one of the chapters of the book, you discuss about the critics. Success, you cannot be liked by everybody. And then, of course, it's also good as critically going through which are the reservation from some of the people. Can you discuss about the critics and maybe the response that you got also from the ground of this model?
In terms of the critics of NRT, that's one of the key reasons why I wanted to go and investigate. That's what a journalist does. You hear bad stories, you hear positive stories, and it's your job to go and try and see for yourself and report back. And, a lot of what the critics were saying, I found out to be what, the critics were saying should be done. So there should be more community involvement. There should be more involvement of the community on the ground, was exactly what NRT was doing. And a lot of what some critics were saying, especially on social media, saying that the land is being fenced off, the land is being taken for mining, the land is being taken for big game hunting, was simply just not true. I didn't find any evidence of this. And this is not a small trip. I spent the best part of a year and a half, almost 2 years actually, going in and around different communities. I spent time both traveling on the back of rangers' trucks, going on long patrols, sort of 2 weeks at a time, and sleeping and camping and living alongside them, and also my own reporting, going off on my own vehicle and spending time camping and talking to the people on the ground. And of course there are problems. the areas covered by the community conservancies is roughly the size of Switzerland, involving multiple ethnic groups, and in an area where there's real security challenges. Still many Kalashnikovs, AK-47s, still battles over cattle raids and land and grazing. So this is no sort of perfect place. One of the things the critics said is that, pastoralists should just be left alone to do what they've always done. And I completely agree. My argument would be that's what NRT is supporting them to do, is to face the modern challenges today, to allow them to continue their traditional way of life while coping with the challenges, whether that's climate change or governance structures or automatic weapons sweeping in from South Sudan or Somalia or Ethiopia. And I think, as a journalist, I saw what these areas were like before NRT impacted. So I was in Masabit, I was in Moyale, right on the border with Ethiopia, reporting on cattle raids. And I remember one time being in Moyale, which I talk about in the book. I was with the Kenyan army, and I thought the cattle raids were over, and I was going in to report about the conflict that was over. And in fact, people started fighting. I was caught up in the middle of, a heavy gun battle with the army sweeping in between, firing into the dirt between the two sides to keep them apart. And I was like, this is not the society in general was facing such challenges from the threats of the modern age. And, there does need to be some sort of peace building effort and governance structures put in place, because the old ways, the things that worked 100 years ago, they need an upgrade for the modern age, just as everywhere in the world does. This is not something unique to Northern Kenya at all. It's a lesson for all of us that, things are no longer the same as they were 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 30 years ago. And finding ways to tackle that is what's really important. So in terms of the critics, absolutely, it's important they have their say. And I interviewed people who were very critical and very negative of NRT. But a lot of what I found simply wasn't borne out by the facts on the ground. And overall, I found a really positive approach that was making real change to communities in northern Kenya that had been marginalized for decades, if not longer. So for me, it was a really, I felt strong enough that I wanted to write a book and put my name to it. And as a journalist, your name is your sort of reputation, as it were. So, if I didn't feel strongly about this, I wouldn't have sat down to write a book. And again, I just wanted to repeat, I wasn't paid anything by NRT. I'm not connected to them beyond the fact that I spent, a couple of years living amongst the communities and felt that this was important. Being told, especially on social media, didn't reflect what I was seeing on the ground.
I think this is something important because as a journalist, you are working for the truth and trying to see with your eyes. And I think 2 years experience, 2 year gathering and working. And I really like also what you wrote in the book. Some of the critics are just more involvement in the community. There are also some of the lesson learned within the movement. And I can see this, it's part of the work because pastoralists, they have been there and they understand the land and the community, and the results that we can see, they are really transforming lives. So I think it's really important. And also the critic, they can act like an incentive or even do more and work more, for the community in Kenya and especially in the north. Towards the end of the book, you discuss about, the way forward of the conserving movement, something that started with these two men that we meet at the beginning of the book, that they were going around seeing animals, and then they witnessed the killing and the slaughter, and then they started this movement. Now they are not even active part of NRT because the new generation has taken part. Now you see the expansion and the way also of this movement in other areas of Kenya, which they have similar challenges. Can you tell us a bit more about the way forward this conserving movement and how you can see, since you have witnessed, how this can help fostering a new model of conservation?
I hope that it continues, and whether it continues to inspire people as directly as NRT, whether that organization itself, expands and continues, or just that concept itself. And I think in northern Uganda now, NRT has been supporting in Kidepo Ugandans to do something, a very similar idea. So, it really is expanding internationally and is applicable to many different areas. I think, in the decades to come, the world is facing big environmental challenges. And I think the lesson that I saw in NRT is that when we read the newspapers by journalists, so often what we see is that environmental change is causing conflict and is driving people apart. And what I saw in northern Kenya was that had happened for many decades. Environmental change was creating conflict between different people. But the organization, through the community conservancies, was bringing people together, and that the common challenges they faced, old rivals who might have hated each other and raided their cattle, but the old rivals were suddenly saying, enough, we have to face this challenge together. Otherwise, it's a zero-sum game. We will both defeat each other and neither will benefit. So in a strange way, those environmental challenges were bringing people together. And that's a real message that I think, we all can learn from wherever we are. And that I think will become increasingly applicable in the decades to come, that we need to stand together and face this common threat. And we'll all do better because we're together, rather than fighting for the scraps, and creating more conflict. In that way, everyone loses. So I think that's the important thing.
And this is a wonderful message that it's really coming out also from the book. We are at the end of our wonderful episode. I cannot recommend more just to read the book, go and see all the wonderful story. We have just touched a couple here in the podcast, but I learned so much, and it was a real also learning journey for me. I want to ask, even as you conclude in the book, a final message, something that you want to share with our audience.
I think it would be just a message of hope. I think so often when you read about environmental challenges, when you read about threats against wildlife, against poaching, against biodiversity collapse, it's really easy to be cynical and say, well, what's the point? If we're all going to be ending up in a fireball, if the world's going to burn, why do we bother to do anything? Let's just enjoy life now and fly as many times as we want and, live an environmentally destructive lifestyle. And I think it's really important to read a story where people have faced incredible challenges and have started to overcome them. Northern Kenya is not out of the woods by any length, but the changes that they've made in the last few decades have really seen a remarkable change. And wildlife coming back to areas that was completely exterminated from, and communities were effectively at war, now living in relative harmony with their neighbors. So the message is, things can change, and we should make every effort we can, because if the people in northern Kenya had given up in the 1980s, then it really would be probably not far off a war zone similar to South Sudan or Somalia. It's neighboring countries where things are so similar, and yet northern Kenya has managed in many ways to turn it around.
And thank you so much, Peter, for this wonderful episode. And then I can also add that you put in the book a wonderful tip for people, like visit the Big North Travel. So we'll put the link there, and then please also be part of this conservation movement and support the community. You have said that the roads are long and dusty, but the adventure awaits. So thank you so much, Peter, and for the wonderful book and this wonderful story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you. Good. Thanks to you all.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.